Hello everyone, and welcome to your Masters in Governance. My name's Sandy, and today we'll be discussing governance and strategy. Today we're here with Dr. De Bono, who'll be sharing his strategic experience with us today. Dr. De Bono, thank you for being with us. My first question is, in general, what is governance and how can it be applied?
Thank you very much. Governance is defined so many different ways by different people. But three main keywords which we generally use to define governance, or rather good governance, is authority, decision-making, as well as accountability. Let us start with explaining each and every part of it. Mm-hmm. Authority very often is described as having a person or a group of persons at the top of any organizations who have the full authority, the full power to actually administer, manage, and take decisions on their behalf, and most of all on behalf of the organization. That's only part of authority because that is power. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, those who are very much inexperienced confuse authority and power. Mm-hmm. When we speak about authority, we're speaking about the ability then to take decisions, to do actions, to do whatever it needs to be done, but for the good purpose, for the good reasons, for the good outcome of themselves, but mostly of those who they are representing. So the authority implies with it a lot of responsibility, and quite a lot of people actually forget this latter part of the assertion. So when you have the authority, you also have the responsibility to act. You also have the right to act on behalf of others according to your wisdom at that particular point in time. When there's a lot of governance discussion going on, a lot of people then tend to criticize decisions, past decisions. This is also very true. However, one must keep in mind that with hindsight, everybody is cleverer. So we cannot either mix neither authority, responsibility, and decisions. As a matter of fact, decision-making is another very important pillar of governance, which implies what? That any person who is then in power and therefore has the authority has also the responsibility. So you see, the word responsibility, I'm attaching it both to the authority as well as the decision-making. Good governance, therefore, implies that a person at the top of the organization also has the responsibility to decide. There were cases in the past, both in the political scene, both in the organizational, which is in the business scene, and in any other particular area which one can look into, where people in authority failed to take a decision. That is not good governance. Because your responsibility, the fact that you are in power, brings with it the responsibility to decide. Because if you're not deciding, you're either abdicating, or else, even more worse, you're postponing, which is the worst thing that you can do, which is procrastination. So abdicating and procrastinating is not decision-making. So good governance is the responsibility to decide. Everyone can criticize your decision at a later point in time. Everybody could say whether the decision was good or bad with hindsight. But the role of the leader in practicing good governance is first to hold the authority. Mm-hmm. And when I say to hold the authority, is to hold as well the responsibility to be in power. And secondly, is to be able to make decisions. One can criticize deliberately whether it was the right decision, whether the decision could have been better, but that has nothing to do with governance. And people actually also mix up governance and the decision that has been taken. Obviously, as long as the decision which has been taken in the interest of those which are represented in that particular organization. Because if the leader is taking a decision which goes against the interest of the organization or the country or the entity, then that's definitely good governance. But as long as the decision which has been taken in the interest of, then that is part of good governance. The third pillar is accountability. And there's quite to say about accountability. And then at the very end, I think we should wrap up and actually looking into these three different pillars collectively. When we say accountability, what are we saying? That any person who has the responsibility to decide, who has the authority to decide, needs to be responsible for his or her actions. Not only at that particular point in time, only, but also after. The accountability also means that the leader, the management, the person, the politician, any person who is at the top, who has the authority, who has the decision-making powers, needs to be ultimately accountable for all other actions. So, we generally say that there's a very good saying that success is owned by everybody, but failure is an orphan. This is very often said, particularly for leaders who may have taken the wrong decision, maybe not in the interest of the organization. This is how I'm terming it wrong. And then at the end of the day, they could claim that, look, I took this decision because I was led to. No, you are never led to take a decision. Good governance sometimes implies that if there are people who are above you and they're asking you to take a decision which you may not necessarily agree with, either because it goes against your values or against your conscience, or because you genuinely believe that the decision which other people are forcing you to do is not the right one, I think good governance also needs to be implied there where you do not agree, and therefore you should not actually pursue that particular decision. So in your first question, which is the fundamental question of what constitutes good governance, we spoke about the authority, we spoke about the decision-making and accountability. And I've tried in a very short time frame here to explain these three pillars independently and separately from each other. However, literature in good governance actually puts these three phrases together, which means that in order to have the right authority, you need to have the right decision-making with it. And to be able to decide, you need to have the authority and remain accountable. So the practice of good governance, and here I'm not only therefore talking about good governance now, but I'm also talking about the practice of good governance, implies an action. Because contrary to what people think, good governance is not a one state, is not a one instance, is not a one action at a particular point in time, but it's a continuous process. I cannot act in a good governing method and mode and process one particular time, and the following day I'm completely, acting in a completely different way. And then I would say that I have good governance, because the actions of good governance implies that there is a continuous process. Right. And the process is also traceable, because people can also criticize your actions for good governance along the way. And this is a very critical part that students following this particular module need to primarily understand, where these three pillars of authority, of decision-making, and accountability are looked into separately, but in order to practice good governance, they need to be looked into collectively. And this sense of collectivism brings about behavior. And then behavior is not only tied to something which is theoretically related to the process of good governance, but behavior is tied to the personal values, beliefs, and orientation of those leaders, of those people who are in leadership position, who are practicing good governance. Because as a concluding statement, there's so much to say about this topic. As a concluding statement, we need to make a very clear difference. Governance is a theoretical thing. It's a theoretical area. It's a theoretical framework. But it needs to be executed by people. Yeah. And when we say that there has been good governance or bad governance, we are not attributing it to a theoretical framework, but we attribute it to people. So ultimately, people with good behavior, good values, and good morality would be able to execute good governance processes along the way.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier the what good governance needs proper traceability. that we would say is one of the principles of good governance. Could you tell us some more?
Different countries, the West, the East, the African countries, and also the Asians, they have interpreted along the years different principles of what constitute good governance. And this is very much entrenched in their own cultural background. Because, and I start with an example which is probably irrelevant, but it explains why principles may vary from one region to another, from one country to another, from one culture to another. In Asian countries, for example, the values of what makes good governance is completely influenced by the regional cultural activities. So is the African continent, and so is the Western continent. We generally attribute good governance more to the Western world. And for us, the principles which are proclaimed in the Western world constitute good governance. But immediately I need to say that we need to look at other governing principles in other regions, not from our own perspective, but from that particular regional cultural perspective as well. And then we can truly understand if there is a variation and why there is a variation. But to go back to your question, what are the main principles of good governance? The first one, I would say, is legitimacy. Okay. And this implies the first aspect of legitimacy is the participation. In any organization, being a small organization, a bigger organization, a country, a region, democracy implies that each and every person gives his or her opinion on a particular decision. For example, when democracy was first initiated by the Greeks, we thought at that particular point in time that we found the solution to good governance. Later on in time, people, even including politicians and those who study politics as their main field, also criticize whether democracy is the best system. But to date, no one has found a better system where all the people of that particular organization, of that particular country, of that particular region, actually voice their opinion. So good governance means that each and every idea, each and every opinion of the different stakeholders in that particular organization needs to be listened to, needs to be heard, needs to be considered, at least considered. If they are all implemented, it's a different story, because part of the democratic process as well is, for example, that the rule of the majority wins. And at times the rule of the majority may not necessarily be the best. But for good governing principles, there needs to be a system in place. It's like, playing a game, playing a football game, playing any game. Before you actually start playing any game, you need to know the rules of the game, and the rules of democracy, the rules of participation are known. So whether you accept them or not, it's a different story. But in any democracy, where there's good governance, the rules are also known and accepted. There needs to be consensus. And part of what I'm saying as well is related to consensus. What does it mean? It means that if you are working, if you are part of an organization, and the organization has its set of rules and principles, people within that organization, primarily they need to know that they exist. Because you cannot work in a particular organization where you don't know the rules. Every country has its rules. Every organization has its set of rules, either clear or unclear, but they're there. Either in a form of policy or in forms of procedures, but they're there. So it's not an excuse that people would say, I don't know the policy. In a court of law, if you go to a court of law and you say, I wasn't aware that that law exists, that is not an excuse. You're still found guilty because it is your duty and responsibility to find out that that law particularly exists. So that is not an excuse, even in an organization. Consensus, however, is a very critical point here of good governance, where those in that particular game, those in that particular country, in that particular organization, whatever it is, know that the rule exists and know the rules of the game and how the game is played. Then you can participate. Then you can be part of it. Then you can be either on one side or another or remain neutral, as long as you know the rules and how the rules are actually applied, implemented in that particular circumstance. It doesn't mean either that the rules cannot change. It doesn't mean that from time to time we cannot have a different set of rules. It doesn't mean that from a time to time, those in power with the consent of others cannot improve them. This is why in any country we have laws which are enacted from time to time. If you go to any parliament in a democracy, what happens is that deputies in chambers and in parliaments actually enact new laws or amend existing laws. And this is part of the game as well, because they realize that society has changed. There is the realization that there has been a change in the societal framework. There has been a change in the way things are being managed in a particular group, and therefore the laws need to reflect that particular change. As a matter of fact, even in Malta, there are some laws which have been enacted years ago. And from time to time, when we, read what's happening in Parliament or listen what's happening in Parliament, this is also part of a good governance, that you can listen to what is happening in the chamber. They enact new laws or they change some of the laws. They do so to reflect the new framework, the new values, the new norms, the new attributions that society is actually practicing at this point in time. And that also reflects part of the consensus. So it is about a push and a pull effect. Those in power need to understand what's happening in the country, in the organization, and they also need to react to it. Sometimes we think that reacting is bad. Reacting is not always bad. If you're able to understand and react to what people are saying, then that is good. If on the other hand, you know that there are changes, but you're not reacting to it, then that's not good governance, you see? And another one is direction. Any person who is directly responsible in managing an organization, a country, any entity, is responsible to lead. And leadership has been discussed so widely. And though this is a governing module, a module in the governance and the MSc in governance, we cannot not look into leadership. Over the years, starting from the 1900s onwards, the leadership theories have evolved dramatically. We started with the trait leadership theories, moving to the behavior leadership theories, moving to the situational theories of leadership, moving to the transactional and transformational leadership theories, moving to the stewardship rather than leadership. But there's one thing in common, that any person who's in the leading position needs to be able to decide, have the authority to lead, and by having the authority to lead and to decide, needs to provide a strategy, needs to provide a direction, needs to lead the group, the team, from one point to another. If the leader fails to do that, that would be described as a leaderless organization. If the leader is not in a position to anticipate, to learn from experiences, to value all those around him or her, and through that develop a new strategic direction, i.e., identifying where the organization, where the entity is at this point in time, and where the organization and the entity would like to be in 6 months, or 12 months, 2 years, 5 years, then the leader is failing. Any organization, any entity, any country, without having a clear direction, is a leaderless organization. Strategy, therefore, is critical, because strategy provides direction. Another good attribute for good performance is actually performance. For good governance is performance. You know just as much as I do that when we speak about performance, we generally attribute it to two words, to efficiency and effectiveness. Good governance means that that particular entity is not happy with the status quo. That particular entity is moving from the current position to a future position, and at the same time that particular organization is achieving results. Any organization that for some particular reason does not achieve results, again, is an organization which is failing. Any organization which rather than achieving results start losing its base, that organization would be regressing, and there would be the disadvantage or also the possibility that for some reason or another that organization becomes extinct. And that is very dangerous, particularly in a democracy. We cannot afford that organizations become extinct for governing purposes as well, because for good governance, you need more than one side of the coin. For good governance, you need more than one side of the principles to be looked into, because it is also a matter of values, it's a matter of belief, it's a matter of opinion, which also, going back to the previous value when we said that participation is important, we cannot have just one sound, but we need different sounds that collectively can make up good music. And I'm not a musician, but I can still understand this. So just one sound, having just the drummer playing, or just the trumpet, it doesn't mean that there's good music. But if you put them together, and this is the role of the leader in an orchestra, put all the different sounds together, you can have good piece of music. And this is what good governance is all about. And this is the efficiency, effectiveness in relation to performance. We spoke about accountability. And I believe that accountability is a critical perspective. Accountability ensures that any actions are traceable. Accountability ensures that any actions which have been taken in the past can be referred to. Accountability means that people are therefore responsible, that they are taking actions which at a later point in time can be reviewed. And that fear that actions can be reviewed brings higher level of accountability. I wouldn't like this to be seen as if Big Brother is watching you, because that would be in a bad state, that would be taking decisions, and I'm taking this particular decision, and at the same time I fear that if I'm going to take it wrong, people would criticize me. Sometimes when there's a lot of unwarranted pressure, leaders fail to take decisions, and therefore they procrastinate because they fear that they're going to be criticized for their decision. I usually say, particularly for those in good leaders, in leadership position, and this is not my original quote, of course, that if you want to be popular, go and sell ice creams and don't be a leader. Steve Jobs said this several times. If you want to be popular, go and sell ice cream, because that makes you a much popular person. When you are in a leadership position, when you are in a governing responsibility position, you are accountable, but the decisions need to be taken too. And the final thing which I would like to emphasize when it comes to good governance is transparency. In order to avoid criticism, in order to be able to move forward, you need to ensure that transparency is at its best. Because even if the decision is not agreed to and is not agreed with, people can still say, I do not agree with that particular decision. However, we know how that decision was taken and why it was taken. We may not agree with it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that good governance implies that you have to agree with each and every decision. That's not what we're talking about. That's not what good governance is all about. But good governance is the ability, is the process that when all these ingredients are put together, they can result in a better outcome. I hope I've, in a nutshell, of course,
very clearly
tried to explain what are the processes of good governance.
Thank you, you have so. Now I'd like to move on to tying in governance with strategy. What would you say is the role of governance in strategy implementation?
This could be tricky, but it's important. Earlier on, we referred to direction as one of the key pillars. And direction is a strategic input. Can you separate good governance with strategy? No. It's like bread and butter. They go together. Because as I referred to earlier on, in order to have and to practice good governance, the role of the governing body, i.e. the leaders, we're using the phrase now, the governing body, needs to lead, needs to develop the strategy, needs to develop a direction. There are three principles that needs to be valued. It needs to be clear, it needs to be communicated, and it needs to be understood. It needs to be clearly written, because if it is too difficult to understand, then it's not making any sense. It needs to be communicated, and this means that strategy is not a document which is owned by a governing body only. Gone are those days when a strategy is sealed in the chairman's office under lock and key, and if need be, you throw away the key as well so that nobody would look into it. That's incorrect. So it needs to be communicated. It needs to be cascaded. But it needs to be cascaded in a particular way which is understood. Meaning what? It's useless communicating a strategy to operational employees in a strategic language, because you would lose them. You would not showing them trust, and you are not respecting them either. I usually hate the state where people in a leadership, in a governing position, they try to show how clever they are and how intelligent they are. Being clever and being intelligent implies that you are able to translate, to transcribe, to communicate each and every part of information to each and every level and every party of the organization. That shows how clever you are, and that shows your integrity. So these three keywords are, in my opinion, critical. But there are some other matters which I can refer to. For example, strategy needs to be linked. Linked to all the different pockets in the organization. Strategy is not taking forward one particular part of the organization, but it's putting all the different parts together. For example, when we teach strategy in one of the business class, I usually bring the example, if the organization is responsible or would like to increase sales by X percentage over the next X months' time. So, that objective needs to be smart. Who is responsible in ensuring that this objective is reached? The inexperienced students would say the sales department. And as a matter of fact, each and every department needs to be responsible in achieving that particular strategic goal. And good governance implies that that strategy is linked to the outcome of every department. Timeframes need to be specified. Once one of the SMART objective principles is timeliness. I cannot say that I want to be amongst the top 5 in a particular industry without saying how, without saying by when, because that would leave a lot of loose ends. You need to create synergy. You need to create synergy in a way where all the different stakeholders would feel that they own that strategy. Because fail to owning that particular strategic orientation would make that strategy less competitive. Meaning what? Meaning that once the strategic direction is identified, once that the governing body would have identified the strategic direction that that entity needs to take in order to achieve its ultimate objectives, each and every party needs to be on board. Now you can always say, and I'm sure that you agree with me, that having each and every person on board at the same time, with the same speed and the same rhythm, is impossible. And if we think that once a strategic direction is announced, you're going to have everybody on board without any fail, I think we would be living in a utopian dream, because that is not possible. However, where do we make mistakes? That people in the governing body give more importance to those who are rejecting and less importance to those who are on board. So a lot of effort there is wasted. A lot of energy is wasted. We need to create good processes. We need to create good systems. We need to create good ways of working, easy ways of working, which are not only conducive to one party, but are conducive to the organization as a whole. And this is a very critical point, because we need to understand that organizations develop. Charles Handy actually says that change is the only constant. Charles Handy also says that organizations are made of humans. Charles Handy also says that organizations which are made of humans are constantly developing. So systems which were applicable 5, 10, 15 years ago, even last year, even last month, even last week, sometimes they're not possible that they keep on being implemented, in the near future. Why? Because the external environment has changed, which brings about the changes in the internal environment, and therefore for good governance also the systems need to change. Because when we speak about governance, we generally only attribute it to leadership, but it is also attributed to structure, and it is also attributed to systems, which are part of the McKinsey 7S model. So here, what I'm putting into the equation in this module is not only the governing literature which is related to organizational governance, but also to strategy and management. Because the question is, how can these two actually, be converged? Is there any convergence between strategy and governance? In a nutshell, I would say that it shouldn't only be convergence, but they should be considered as one. Because there isn't good governance without a strategy.
Okay, thanks for that. What would you say is behind an ineffective strategy execution?
Anything which we said, but on the other way around.
Definitely.
But yes, ineffectiveness is brought about primarily by people. If you print a document and you leave it on your desk, that is not ineffective, even if it says the worst things ever, because it's not implemented. So who implements a strategy? People. And, you work as a consultant, so you know just as much as I do that ultimately people implement strategies. So the efficiency, effectiveness, or lack of efficiency, or lack of effectiveness, it depends how people actually implement. And what are the main failures? They fail to communicate, they fail to show, they fail to build processes, fail to understand, fail to relate to others, fail to really appreciate what others are trying to tell you. You're very dogmatic, and you think there's only one way principle, no matter how you can implement this. I don't know. The list is endless. And each and every part of this list, and this is what's amazingly true, is also based on the assumption that it is led by people. So the inefficiencies and ineffectiveness, I would summarize them, as a person who has been working in strategy for over 20, 25 years, I would summarize them as being the inability of people to understand and realize how you can reach organizational goals through people, and you think that you can reach them on your own. When you are not able to understand that the implementation of strategy is the implementation of good governance. When you fail to understand that the implementation of good strategy in a good governing way, it's the ability to teach people. It's the ability to train them. It's the ability to make them as good as you are. It's the ability to empower them. It's the ability to actually put them in the right place at the right time. It's the ability to trust them. It's the ability to let them make mistakes. So these are very much behavioral issues, which are all tied up to the proper execution of strategy. Now, you may say that this would vary from one organization to another, and you would be absolutely correct. People in power, sometimes they do not understand this, and I'm making a very clear difference here between those in power and those in authority. People in power think that power is something which belongs to them. And therefore they are afraid to share it. People in authority understand that authority needs to be shared. And they are as good as much as their subordinates. And this applies in any example, even in any business organization. A leader is as good as his or her followers. A manager is good as his or her employees. Success is reached by employees and not only by the leader. But it's the leader who ultimately believes that all those around him or her should be trained, competent enough to be able to execute. If you fear that you're sharing your resources, if you fear for some reason that you're sharing your experience, if you fear that by sharing your experience, employees are going to be as good as you are, and therefore they can take your job, then you lost the plot. And this is how we need to reinverse the whole principles. And this is why I constantly talk about authority rather than power. This is why I constantly talk about power, about accountability, about authority and decision making, which were the three main principles that we spoke about in the first question of this part of the module. And they are important because together they constitute efficiency and effectiveness. And the story goes round and round again.
Okay, thank you. And what would you say are the qualities of strategic governance?
Well, the qualities of strategic governance basically can be summarized in, first of all, you need to anticipate. A good leader, a good governing body, is one which understands the current situation thoroughly, is able to take stock of what is happening, both within the organization, whatever the organization is, both internally and externally. And within a very short period of time has the wisdom to learn that certain actions needs to be taken. One of the clear examples is the ability to anticipate. As a matter of fact, even years back in one of my leadership examples, I spoke a lot about the concept of anticipatory leadership. And in my opinion, anticipatory leadership is leading today for tomorrow. So I'm taking certain actions today, which may not necessarily be understood today, but they would serve a good purpose tomorrow. It's like, what our parents and grandparents used to tell us that you save for a rainy day. That is a principle of good governance, and you are anticipating that on a rainy day, you still need to spend a penny. So you're saving that penny now for a rainy day. Anticipation, being able to anticipate the future as much as you can, of course, because if we can read the future, I mean, everybody would start betting on different things. Yeah. That is not the point. But learning from past experiences, ability to read past experiences and the present situation, to be able to take decisions today which would serve tomorrow. Part of the main issues that we face is that people in leadership positions, in governing bodies, they work in a completely different way. They see what happened in the past, they study it today, and they implement something tomorrow which is related to yesterday. So like 2 days backwards. This is completely the opposite. Today, you're learning from the past, but you're deciding for tomorrow. So this question of anticipatory leaders is important. Another aspect is the concept of having society of choice, the choice of good society, which means that the norms, the values, the beliefs that needs to be entrenched in any society needs to be prim and proper. This is a question where there's a lot of issues discussed from time to time. Some people actually criticize what constitute good values and what does not constitute good values. And this is where I've started from in the very beginning of this session, where I've said that in order to understand governance, we need to understand it within a context. Yeah. And the regional cultural context plays a very critical, important role. And this is why I'm saying that questions of societies of good governance needs to be looked into. Undoubtedly, strategic effectiveness is also a very important matter. And this implies that any strategic decision needs to bring results. Ultimately, leaders, members of the governing bodies are judged not by their effort. The legacy which they leave behind is not effort related, but the legacy which any person leaves behind is results related. At the end of the day, people remember results, but they don't remember anything else.
True.
So this legacy of results oriented remains important. Now you can tell me, are we going to reach results at the expense of people? No, this is not what I'm saying. But any legacy needs to be results oriented.
Okay. And my last question for you, Dr. De Bono, is what are the requirements of sound strategic governance?
Again, I start with ethics. We can spend a whole module discussing ethics, what is ethics, how individual values, moralities, norms lead to unethical behavior, leads to an accepted societal ethical behavior. But undoubtedly, ethics is a very important principle. The global ethical framework needs to be taken very much into account. What is the ethical framework? The ethical framework is that each and every decision which is taken by any governing body needs to be understood and needs to be contextualized in a wider framework. For example, if I am hungry and I'm walking, in one of the beautiful streets in our city, in Valletta, in our capital, I don't just go in any restaurant and grab a sandwich and leave because I'm hungry, because there are norms, values, and beliefs. And just because I'm hungry does not permit me to do things which society forbids me of doing. This is part of the definition of ethics. So if I'm not agreeing with someone, the ethical behavior does not imply that I'm going to look into this in the face and start accusing and putting forward a number of accusations, left, right, and center, without having proof of what I'm saying. So the norms, the values, and beliefs of any society are principled about the ethical considerations of that particular society at that particular point in time. Ethics do change. And very often we imply the introduction of ethics, where for some reason or another, the legal aspect fails to give us any answers, any reason. So ethics, the ethical moral value, the norms, the values and beliefs is one of the major principles for what you're asking. Then undoubtedly, and we are very much in favor of this, is the cognitive part, is education.
Yes.
Members of society needs to be taught. And this is not a dogmatic principle that we are saying here, sitting on an armchair and trying to lecture people around. No. When we're talking about education, we are not talking about the curriculum. We are not talking about particular subjects such as math, such as English, such as Maltese, such as, any other principal subject. This is not what we're talking about. But a matter of education is a matter of proper decision-making principles, is a matter of how to live in a societal framework, is matter how to respect others around you, is matters how to be able to appreciate the values of others, is the ability to listen to what others have to tell you, is the ability of disciplining yourself, is major principles which go beyond just principles, matters related to the formal education. So it's an informal and formal important, but it needs to be learned, it needs to be developed, and it needs to be constant. Very often we say that education is expensive, then try ignorance. So educating people, educating others without sounding dogmatic, that they need to learn how to behave in a society in order to appreciate that if you're not the leader, you're a member of a team. Because we spoke a lot about the role and the responsibility of the governing body. But there's also roles and responsibility of members in that particular entity. And there are roles of members which are specific and needs to be learned and needs to be understood as well. There needs to be resources. Any organization without having the right resources. And resources could be not only those which are financially related, but also the non-financially related. Resources which are induced and which are put forward to any member so that he or she can use at any particular point in time to be able to move ahead. So these are just three examples of how we can bring sound strategic governance. There are undoubtedly others. As a concluding statement, governance is one of those areas, is one of those subjects which is highly debated. Because, as I said earlier on, it is very often contextualized. Strategy is also one of those subjects which is highly debated, because like governance, it is also contextualized. Strategic governance, therefore, it's one of those subjects where students following this module need to understand that it is an action or a series of actions that are taken by the governing body at a point in time to achieve better results for the organization, the direction. These decisions need to be taken in the light and with respect of others around you, your members. The person making decisions, the authority, needs to take the right decision making, and needs to be transparent. So, in a nutshell here, we've tried to summarize all the major principles that we've discussed during this session, which I found extremely interesting.
Same here. And I'd like to thank you for your time today, Dr. De Bono.
Thank you, Sandy.
So there you have it. Today we spoke about governance and strategy, where our key topics included the definition of governance and how it can be applied. We tied it into strategy, and we looked into what constitutes an effective and an ineffective strategy. And last, we ended with principles of sound strategic governance. That's it for today. Thank you, and see you next time.